Hi, this is Karen Fabian, founder of Bare Bones Yoga, and I'm here today to do a brief tutorial on the knee. And of course, the knee in the context of practicing yoga. So I want to talk about a couple of specific things about the knee in terms of cues that you can give your students to help their knees kind of stay in a healthy position. And, kind of one of the things to think about from a movement perspective is because the knee joint is lower than the hip joint, right? When you ask somebody to move from the hip, they may in fact move from the knee. So what does this mean? Let's take tree pose for instance. As I open my hip or externally rotate my hip, my knee moves. So here it's not so much of an issue because I'm standing, I'm working in concert with gravity, and there's really no pressure on the knee. Even if I'm making this movement of externally rotating more with the movement coming from the knee joint itself, okay? But if I take that same mindset and I put myself in a position where I'm close to the ground, it totally changes from the perspective of safety. So here, if I come into pigeon and I'm thinking about bringing my knee forward and opening my hip, but I'm doing it more from the knee, now I'm putting some pressure on the knee as I come closer to the floor, rather than making the movement come from the hip. The same thing would hold if I was sitting here and I wanted to open the hip, but I was trying to push my knee forward. Same thing as if I was coming onto my back and taking figure 4 and I just pushed from the knee. So from a cueing perspective, one of the things I'd suggest is that you cue the student at the joint where you want the movement to be coming from. Keeping in mind that when people move, they're going to move generally from a place that is more accessible from a movement availability perspective. And for many people, if you say open your hip, it might feel easier for them to make that movement from the knee. And when you think about it, we really want our knees to be steady, right? We want to keep the joint capsule, the ligaments on the medial and lateral side and the rear, the back side of the leg, posterior side. We want to keep them steady. We really don't want to be moving, even though the knee joint can move laterally and medially. It really much prefers to work in this flexion and extension plane. So as we move it in that side-to-side plane, we want to encourage people to move from the hip. And as we know, many people have tight hips when it comes to opening the hip, externally rotated, right? I'm not talking about extension of the hip, I'm talking about external rotation. So they're going to move from there. So what I would say, oftentimes, and this can be overly complicated by a mindset that when I come into a posture like pigeon, I have to get my shin parallel with the front edge of the mat, which I think is a pretty old school cue that I hope people are not cueing to anymore. Because for most people to get their shin parallel with the front edge of the mat, you can see for me, I actually have to come out of the pose. I don't have that kind of availability in my hip joint to externally rotate that far. And so the only way I can get my shin parallel is to kind of lie on my side. So again, I don't really think we want our students to develop flexible knees. I don't even really think we want them to develop overly flexible hips in the external rotation plane. But we can certainly encourage some external rotation, but it should be coming from the hip joint. Okay, so that's that one piece there. The other thing that I would look for as you're working with folks is hyperextension of the knee. So you can't completely see it because I have the leggings on, but if I overly straighten my legs, that's hyperextension. And as I come into different postures where I'm standing on one leg, again, tree pose is one, I might leverage the joint to try to create a stable pose, okay? Same with things like triangle. As I come into triangle pose, I might leverage this joint to try to stay steady instead of working with muscle. And you'll potentially notice, you can't really see it in this video, but as you're teaching, if you look at students' knees, when they do hyperextend, many times, depending on the student, but in most of the cases I've seen, the kneecap moves laterally, medially. So the patella moves more towards the inside of the knee. And this could potentially have to do with some weakness in the quadricep muscle that runs on the medial aspect of the thigh, because it inserts on the kneecap, the patella, through the patellar tendon. But even if you didn't know that, just keeping with this mindset of trying to create some symmetry in postures, not so much symmetry from the perspective of side to side, but this idea of centering, okay? It makes sense or stands to reason that you wouldn't really want to create a posture where the kneecap was sliding over while the foot was straight, right? So this can happen more as people hyperextend. Their knee can kind of lazily move in. You'll see it too in poses where you're asking someone to rotate their torso, like in Warrior Two. Oftentimes their knee will come along with them. And so this is one of the really cool skills that we develop in yoga practices, that we can isolate where we're moving from in one part of the body while keeping something else still. Okay, so here we want people to open up, but we don't want them to take their knee to that direction as well. We want to keep the knee cap straight ahead. And you can think of that from the perspective of not overly wearing and tearing. I mean, I don't really literally mean tearing, but not overly wearing on one side of the knee versus the other, from the perspective of the ligaments that support the knee itself. So again, just things to look for as you're teaching, things to look for as you're practicing. You know, the knee piece about moving from the hip versus the knee is a really important one to keep in mind as you're doing different poses. And as you're teaching, thinking about how that, that issue, that factor, should inform the cues that you give to your students, so that you can be cueing them in such a way to create that kind of healthy alignment. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, Karen@barebonesyoga.com. When you go on my website, barebonesyoga.com, you're going to see a number of different downloads that you can take advantage of for free. I have one on building yoga sequences and one on general yoga anatomy. I also have a number of webinars on my website that I've hosted over the past year or so, and so those cover a bunch of different topics. And I also have an online class that you can download, which is on the online class page, that will give you 60 minutes of a practice you could do, you could watch. It's filled with more anatomy cues than you would ever get in a standard class, and that was the reason why I built it that way. I wanted you to have a lot more information than you would get in just a standard class. It's actually kind of more like a workshop. So I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, Karen@barebonesyoga.com. Namaste.